Alberta Premier Danielle Smith introduced her controversial Alberta Sovereignty Act, Bill number 1, in the legislature yesterday. And, well, to say it set off a political firestorm would be a somewhat of an understatement. So I'm going to talk to Professor Duane Bratt, who's a political scientist from the Mount Royal University, about that. So welcome to the interview, Duane.
Hey, Mark, I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'll tell you, we need some clarity because this is a confusing mess full of, claims and counterclaims and uncertainties. Can you walk us through the basics of the issue?
Okay, so in preview interviews over the last couple days, I said this is either going to be a lot of fiery rhetoric, but a symbolic bill. Something like the Saskatchewan First Act, where they simply reassert provincial jurisdiction in things that are already embedded in the Canadian Constitution. So it'll sound really, we're standing up to Ottawa, but it's really nothing. Or it could be what she campaigned on in July and August and September, which was we're going to give the provincial government, the provincial legislature, the ability of nullifying federal laws. It's the latter. It is clear that you can bring motions to the legislature on any past act, current act, or anticipated act by the federal government, and the legislature will determine if it is federal overreach into provincial jurisdiction, and therefore they will direct provincial entities to ignore that federal law. This is consistent with what she said in the summer, and it is a complete reversal of all constitutional jurisdictional disputes in the past. The Constitution laid out powers for the federal government, laid out powers for the provincial government. There's some concurrent powers, but those aren't watertight compartments. Those often mix. So, for example, the provinces have control over natural resources, but if you want to build a pipeline across provincial boundaries, that becomes federal jurisdiction. Or the carbon tax case, where, yes, the environment is joint concurrent jurisdiction, but because climate change affects the entire country, that superseded natural resources. That's the way things have been done in Canada, for 155 years. Through the courts, not through the provincial government unilaterally deciding one way or another whether the federal government has overreached or not. So that's problem number 1 with this, and that was evident back
let's deal with number 1 because that's a big one. That
I think the second one's pretty darn big too.
It is indeed, and we'll get to number 2 in a minute. But now look. Over the last few days, I've been watching legal scholars like Professor Martin Olashinsky from the University of Calgary weigh in on the constitutionality. And I've interviewed Martin before. He's a very, level-headed guy. And he called Danielle Smith a dictator yesterday. That's how severe this is. And that is kind of a peek behind the curtain as to just how serious this issue is politically.
Well, so the stuff on issue number 1 about nullifying federal legislation, or their term was violate federal law. They will direct provincial entities to violate federal law. Jason Kenney, who resigned yesterday, just as another interesting day in Alberta politics, said the Sovereignty Act would make Alberta a laughingstock in Confederation. Christy Clark, the former premier, said it was batshit crazy. And so this debate was going on months ago in the anticipation of this. And while Smith has said that she will respect the Supreme Court of Canada, I think what she wants to do is nullify federal laws in the province of Alberta and force the federal government to sue Alberta. What does that look like? Could it be, we've decided the carbon tax, even though we lost the carbon tax case, there's new information, inflation, the war in Ukraine, we want to relitigate it. But in the time period before it goes to the Supreme Court, we're just going to tell the city of Calgary, don't bother paying the carbon tax. And the city of Calgary will have to follow that directive. And so, yeah, this could be a major constitutional crisis before we even get into item number 2. And what's also interesting is in the fact sheet that the Alberta government released yesterday, they talk about disallowance. Under the Canadian Constitution, the federal government actually has the power to disallow provincial legislation. Just what I described the province wanting to do to federal legislation, except they've got that power. They have used that power, albeit they haven't used it in decades. And in the press conference, Premier Smith almost seemed to dare Prime Minister Trudeau to use disallowance because she wants a fight with Trudeau. Trudeau may not want to fight with Smith, but Smith definitely wants a fight with Trudeau.
Well, it seems to me that it'll be the first grounds on which Premier Smith and her cabinet use this power, and that is the already announced but not yet fully designed and implemented federal oil and gas emissions cap. Yeah. Now, this is an example of how. So, if you're Suncor, Cenovus, CNRL, Imperial Oil, and you know where the federal government is going with this. You've been negotiating with them for months, years, really, on lowering emissions, and their customers are talking about this. Their investors are talking about it. It has to happen, and then so Premier Smith decides to disallow the anticipated legislation and regulations around that cap, and you're the CEO of one of those companies, you're really put in an impossible situation.
It's actually a bit even more complicated than that, because they have said repeatedly, and it's in the bill, they cannot direct individuals or private companies from violating federal law. Only provincial entities. But they're using such a broad definition of provincial entity. So they're saying any group that receives a government grant, any group that is regulated. Well, are engineers regulated? So are there tax incentives that the Alberta government has for oil sands development? Of course they are. Does that make CNRL or Suncor a provincial entity? I don't know. I think the lawyers are going to have to hash that out. But you're right. If I am the CEO of one of those companies and I've got the provincial government encouraging me to violate federal law, am I going to do that knowing I have to deal with the federal government as well? And so, yeah, that may very be at the crux. And I could see a resolution coming out on this cap even before the cap is introduced, because it's anticipated harm.
Indeed. Let's go on to number 2, because this is a humdinger. I'll leave it to you to explain. This is what the
shock was yesterday. So I had thought that that number 1 about nullifying federal law was a possibility, because they talked about the possibility. But I didn't anticipate how much they were going to erode Alberta democracy to fight Ottawa. And so this would give the Premier and Cabinet what we were collectively refer to as Henry VIII powers, to rule by decree outside of Parliament. So a simple resolution, let's say we say oil and gas emissions cap harms Alberta, or has the potential of harming Alberta. We will direct the Cabinet to do whatever it needs to do so. So they could amend legislation without the oversight of the legislature. Now, Cabinet can already issue orders in council, but it can't bring in legislation or change legislation without going through the legislature. And even with a majority government, bills are often amended. Backbench members have an opportunity of raising issues. That has all been removed. And they say, well, that will take into effect for 2 years with a renewal of another 2 years. That's an extraordinary power to give to the Cabinet. In addition, that whole issue about making directives to provincial entities that I mentioned earlier, that's also in there. That is a huge power to have, given how widely they are defining that. And they're still allowing judicial review. In a normal bill, there is judicial review. that it can be challenged. But instead of it being 6 months, it is 30 days. That's a very quick time period to get your lawyers under place. So this grants huge powers to the cabinet, of the likes of which we haven't seen except in a war situation or an emergency situation. Justin Trudeau, in the early weeks of the COVID pandemic, floated the idea of requesting these sorts of powers federally. And there was huge blowback at the time by the Conservative Party, by the NDP Party, and members of the Liberal Party and the public. And so they backtracked from that. They said, even in the middle of a health emergency, this is huge overreach. Well, there's no crisis. There's no, I mean, the pandemic is still around, but it's not what it was in 2020. So what's the crisis? Well, if the crisis is Justin Trudeau, he's been around for 7 years. 7 years isn't a crisis. So this is, we are going to damage democracy in Alberta in order to fight Ottawa. That was the message that came across yesterday.
Well, it seems like the crisis for the Smith government is the election that presumably will take place next spring. So what does this mean for Rachel Notley?
She could be put in a very difficult situation. And already you're seeing Smith say, you know, the NDP is supporting Trudeau because they voted against first reading of the bill yesterday. Typically, Bill 1 passes unanimously because Bill 1 is perfunctory. The real challenge is during the second reading, because that's when committees look at it. That is when amendments are proposed. That's when they really dig into it. So usually throne speech occurs, Bill 1 is introduced, everybody gives unanimous consent, they move on. In this case, the NDP voted against unanimous consent. And so this was highlighted. Smith specifically called out Rachel Notley, even though Rachel Notley wasn't even in the legislature yesterday, which in itself is unusual for a throne speech. So she didn't even vote no, because she wasn't there. But the NDP is going to be put in a position where if they oppose this bill, they're obviously supporting Trudeau and they're obviously supporting the federal government, as opposed to opposing this bill because it's unconstitutional and it dramatically erodes Alberta democracy, the likes of which we probably haven't seen again since the 1930s and Bill Aberhart. And we've talked about Bill Aberhart in the past. Even Bill Aberhart never took on these sorts of powers.
Well, okay, so Trudeau's reaction yesterday was kind of interesting because he really downplayed this. He focused on, you know, some of the issues that are important to the federal government, and it's pretty clear at this point that he doesn't want to pick a fight with Smith. Is there a point where he might wade into this battle? Is there what's the political calculus for him?
He spoke a bit more this morning. Because with the time difference, I was able to catch that. And he said he is quite concerned with Bill 1. But then he said the fact that so many Albertans over the last 16 hours have become very concerned by this heartens him. He says, I'm not interested in a fight with Alberta. And I think that's true. But it is clear that Danielle Smith wants a fight with Justin Trudeau. And so she is, I think, laying a situation out to almost force Trudeau to get involved. And I don't think it's going to be involving right now. Let's let Bill 1 play itself out. You don't want to intervene while Alberta MLAs are debating something like this. But let's say when the spring rolls around and they do their first resolution, and the resolution is on oil and gas emissions caps or gun seizures or relitigating the carbon tax, the federal government is going to have to get involved in this because they cannot allow a situation with one province just saying, yeah, we're not going to respect federal authority.
I think everyone agrees that Calgary is going to be the key battleground in the upcoming election. What's your take? I mean, you live in Calgary. What's your take on how Calgarians are going to receive Bill 1?
So we're not happy with the federal government. We have seen we're not happy with the carbon tax. We're not, even in an urban center, we're not happy with gun policy. There's a lot of things we don't like about the Trudeau government, but we also don't like crazy. And this is crazy policy. And so Danielle Smith has this reputation of throwing these ideas around, which is why she never got a honeymoon after becoming leader, why polls have shown them trailing the NDP, particularly in the city of Calgary. That's why she refused to have a by-election in Calgary Elbow, and that seat has been empty since August. We're now seeing another seat empty in Calgary with Jason Kenney's resignation. She also won't have a by-election there because she's fearful of losing it. So Calgary is an educated city. It's a wealthy city. There's a lot of disputes that we've got with the federal government. We vote conservative federally, but this is damaging to the business environment. This is damaging to the political environment. I cannot see this playing itself out well unless you're such a hardcore partisan that anything the UCP does is good. And if you oppose it, you must be a Trudeau or Notley shill.
Well, it seems to me that one of the points that gets made over and over again is that investors like stability, and instability chases away capital. Yeah, given how, as you say, how crazy this is, I suppose investors are going to say, well, maybe we'll wait and see how this all plays out. They're not going to get upset today, but it looks like.
Do you wait for that? I mean,
well, that's a good question, isn't it?
Do you anticipate the potential of capital flight and investor chill, or do you wait until it happens and go, oh my God, $10 billion of investment is fleeing the province, or we need additional investment and it's simply not coming in here and we don't know why. Already, Deborah Yedlin, the head of the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, has come out against the Sovereignty Act. There was an extraordinary press conference in September involving Travis Taves, Brian Jean, Rajan Sawhney, and Leela Heer, four leadership rivals of Smith, where Taves, the former finance minister, said that this was going to lead to investor uncertainty. It was going to lead to capital flight, and it was a really bad idea. Well, Travis Taves is back in cabinet. He's back as finance minister. Brian Jean, who's in that press conference, is in the cabinet. Rajan Sawhney is now in the cabinet. Do they feel the same way today as they felt back in September? They could make the argument if it was simply a symbolic bill, as I described, like what Saskatchewan has, then they could have said, things were modified and we can move on. But the way I have described Bill 1 today is it is worse than what they described in their press conference in September. And so what does Taves have to say now? How well briefed was he on the implications, or did they think through all of the implications of this bill?
Well, these are extraordinary times, Duane. Thank you very much for this. And no doubt you and I will be talking about it again in probably the very near future.
Okay. Thank you, Markham.